Show your support for the Untold Radio Network family of shows and join in on the conversation by using super stickers and super. Show your support for the Untold Radio Network family of shows and join in on the conversation by using super stickers and super chats on YouTube. Got a question you want answered? Ask it live via a super chat and get real-time responses from our show's knowledgeable hosts and guests. Help keep the Untold Radio Network shows running strong. We need your support. Send your super chats and stickers now.
Well, 2 months ago, we had the UFO congressional hearings here in Washington, which captured world attention. But what captured world attention perhaps even more was what took place last week in Mexico City when the Mexican UFO, or the Mexican Congress, not to be outdone by the Americans, had their own UFO-related congressional hearing. And you'd have to be living in a hole probably not to have seen the alleged mummified alien bodies that were shown at that congressional hearing. And they were presented by longtime UFO journalist and just ufologist Jaime Maussan, and presented them as the genuine item, as proof of non-human intelligences living on this planet. Tonight, we're looking at a documentary called MAUSSAN'S UFO Files, which predates this most recent story by a few years, but still gives us a sense of some of the other things that Jaime Maussan has looked at over the years and a sense of the man himself. And we'll be talking about that as well as what Jason and I think about the alien mummies tonight on Mysterious Library.
Well, hello there. It's going to be interesting. That's all I'm going to say.
I expect so. As I teased you before the show, I was going to start off with a joke tonight. I was going to do it in my intro, a very lame joke that I wrote in the shower while I was getting ready for the show, and it occurred to me that there was some genuine humor in the story that we're looking at tonight. But I thought I'll make Jason suffer it as well as the audience and see if he laughs or he cringes. So here's a joke written by your mysterious librarian, one of them anyway, moi. So there's a US congressman and a Mexican congressman, and they're drinking beers in a little cantina in Mexico City. The US congressman's there. He's part of a diplomatic envoy to the country, and the Mexican congressman is just killing a little bit of time before a hearing's about to start that he has to go into in the Capitol building across the street. And they're talking shop, as people will do. And the US congressman says, son, you should have been in Washington a couple months ago. We had this incredible hearing on UFOs or UAPs or whatever the kids are calling them these days. We had this one guy, this Navy pilot. He said he and all his colleagues are seeing these craft that defy all types of the laws of physics zapping through the skies, and they can't be ours. Not to be outdone, a Navy commander was there who'd filmed one of these things. It looked like a Tic Tac floating around and buzzing in the sky again, defying all the laws of physics and gravity and everything else. And he says, but the most extraordinary the most extraordinary witness was his whistleblower. And he told us that during his investigations, people in the military and intelligence services had told him that not only the US government, but governments all around the world had in their possession down-flying saucers and the biological remains of the creatures who flew these craft. Mexican congressman looks down at his watch and he looks across at the Senate building. He knows it's almost time to go into his hearing and he says, "Gringo, hold my Tecate."
That is awful.
Yeah, I thought so, but
I love it.
But it sets the tone in a way. I mean, that's what happened, right? We had this one hearing, which was kind of overblown, and all these claims, which people were, at least people like us, were saying some of Grush's claims seem to be a little, unprovable, to say the least. And then 2 months later, we get these paper mache mummies rolled out in Mexico City as alien bodies. It was spectacular.
I will say, I don't think they're paper mache. Hold on. Some people may not know what this is. I'm going to put up the image. We'll talk about this later. It's what's called a tease in the business. Not that I'm very good. I think we're dealing with another one of these. But we'll talk about that later. You muted yourself.
Well, what you put up on the screen, that at least looks like a genuine biological entity of some type. As it was, but we'll get to that as well. I was only talking on when I had Wayne Klingman on Talking Weird on Saturday night. I was talking about how myself and my girlfriend and my brother all made these paper mache gray extraterrestrials for a Roswell 50th anniversary party we held when we were in university, and they looked more convincing than the things rolled out in the Mexican Congress.
I will say something that allow me to say this, okay? 2 points. Playing devil's advocate, or in this case, aliens advocate, mummified aliens advocate. We don't know what extraterrestrial flesh looks like when it's mummified. Secondly,
we do know what paper mache looks like,
right? But this was supposedly found in essentially diatomaceous earth, which in Peru, which acts like a natural preservative, and therefore that's why it has the look that it has. It's naturally occurring mummies do look very, very odd. We're used to them having more of a sheen to the skin, like the Iceman. I forget what we call him. There's several others. Actually, a lot of them come out of Peru. In fact, because it's very, very dry in a lot of places. So it's not uncommon to have sort of these naturally occurring mummies, and for them to have a very, particularly from Peru in that particular earth, to have a very chalky appearance to them. So I will say that, but I'll stop there. I'll just say there's reason to look at the skin and be like, okay, it looks like paper mache. I don't think it's paper mache at all.
God bless you, Jason, for being fair and reasonable, unlike me.
Well, my quick thoughts on that this last week were I've specifically called out what I would normally say in this situation, which is me being reasonable and why I'm not. But let's anything else going on in your life before we get to the
people are probably sick of hearing me talk about my rural existence, and the fall comes and I harvest my potatoes and my pumpkins are all growing, and it's just it's the joy of the seasonal shift here at the moment. That's nothing more exciting than that, really.
Well, we have had a seasonal shift as well, and we're back. We're down to being in the 90s, so we've actually had some rain. So we're happy.
Down in the 90s. Well, I do love Texas. I don't love your temperatures, though.
It takes some getting used to. Yeah, I'm fifth gen. When I hear people complaining about it, I'm like, you do realize where you are. This happens every year. It should not come as a surprise. We all have AC. Suck it up.
Somebody loves your beard, by the way. Barbara Burpless doesn't love mine, but yours is a pretty one, apparently.
Yeah, I keep thinking. I think I'm gonna start adding like a little bit of color to it, because I get these I have this like white spot here, so it kind of looks like I have a hole in my beard, and I don't. Like, just something to give it a little extra, because the camera, right? You got to deal with the camera. And my background.
I like your beard too.
Oh, well, thank you.
And thank you, Barbara. She said she liked mine as well. I was fishing for that compliment.
Don't do this. No. Stand by your convictions, Barbara. No, don't do that. Don't encourage the Australian.
Well, I don't need that much encouraging, as everybody knows. You know what we should do before we tear apart the mummies, though, is we should talk about the documentary itself a little bit.
Yes. No. And yeah.
The
Exactly.
Mawson UFO Files, which I think came out in 2019. It's directed by the same guy who directed the Underground documentary, by the way, that we looked at a couple of months ago.
Yeah, and it is very well put together, right? As far as these kinds of documentaries go, right? It's aesthetically very pleasing, right? And it's hold on, we need to pause. Suzanne has rented The Legend of Bucky Creek. Was it at least worth watching?
I hope you enjoyed it, Susan.
Yeah, it is of the time, but now I gotta know if Susan liked it. That's what's going to be baking my noodle all day.
I'll pop
but aesthetically speaking, right? It's clever, right? It does its job well. I think from a visual perspective, it's never really boring, right? Let's face it, we've faced regardless of content, we've watched some really lame documentaries. So it's definitely it feels like, okay, you know what it really feels like? A television show. Remember Sightings from the 90s?
Well, a lot of it, I think, is because it's taken from some of Mawson's shows, so it has that feeling. I think a lot of the actual parts of it aren't the documentarians themselves out there shooting these segments, because it's called the Mawson UFO Files. I think they were obtaining footage for segments from him, so in a way it kind of, I guess, looks at some of the more interesting cases that Mawson had covered on his various TV shows and specials over the course of I don't know, 30 years or something, right?
Oh, exactly. And it's, like I said, it feels like the sort of like an episode of Sightings from back in the day. Like, again, it's worth the watch, right? It's definitely aesthetically pleasing. If you have Amazon Prime, it's free. I will say there's a very large section of the second half, because it's only like an hour, like a little over an hour long. It's not long at all. Again, this really feels like it's an episode of a television show. Not a complaint, just observation. But there's a large part of that second half that's very much in Spanish, so you have to switch over to the English subtitles to watch it. And I do wonder who was doing the translation for the English subtitles on that, because some of it, but whatever. So again, aesthetically, it's fine. It's, it's got a nice quick pace to it. It's definitely, you want to watch it, it's worth a watch. Certainly nothing bad. The first half, though, is essentially Jaime's history as a journalist, right? Because he is a journalist. That's what he started off on, and tells the story of young Jaime, son of a bullfighter and rancher in Mexico, and his journey into journalism, and how he originally, my favorite part was, he didn't want to be a journalist because journalists were all corrupt. It's like, Jaime, this may be the first thing you've ever said I completely agree with.
I like a number of things that Jaime says. One of the things I like recently, I don't think it was in the documentary, I saw it somewhere else, where he was talking about the importance of UFO field not becoming a laughing stock. And this is the man who rolls out the alien mummies. Just saying. But listen, in fairness, Jaime has been called out as a hoaxer, which we'll get to a number of times. But my impression when I watched the documentary is more than a hoaxer. I think he's just a believer.
Yes.
I think he has been, as many people do, there's this kind of assumption that if somebody puts forward something which isn't the genuine article, then they went away and manufactured it and hoaxed it themselves. Often it's the case of somebody who desperately wants evidence to prove the quest of a lifetime, in which case Jaime's has been searching for evidence of UFOs. So if something lands on his desk or lands in his email, I'm assuming, and sounds like a legitimate proof of what he's pursued for the better part of a life, then you might be more inclined, I think psychologically most people are, to accept that as something worth pursuing than if you were somebody who was skeptical and would just be its paper mache, mate. You know, I'm not
I'm
presenting
sorry.
this as
Something that was worth what?
pursuing. Did I say pursuing? I'm not even sure what I said.
Yeah, you said pursuing.
Did I say it in an Australian accent? Or?
Yeah.
Oh.
It's the rain in Spain falls mainly on the plane. Okay,
That's
I'm
true.
done.
But speaking about the rain in Spain falling mainly on the plane, of course, these mummies are from Nazca, Peru, supposedly,
Yep.
or nearby the great ancient astronaut Mecca, where those lines indicate that there was, at least according to ancient astronaut theorists, that once upon a time the space aliens needed a landing strip and they were guided in. I'm guessing flying saucers need somewhere like, a mile long to land on. But whatever the case is, Nazca has long been one of those mecca points for believers in ancient astronaut theory. So, of course, when the mummies came out, now we're jumping all over from the film forward again. It's hard to leave this mummy story alone, man. It's really difficult to leave.
Let's
We'll
focus
run back on the film.
focus on Jaime, because actually I made that same point on my Friday's quick thought, which is that Jaime is a true believer, right? The one thing I will say, and I'm very sympathetic to Jaime for, Jaime is a true believer. At no point do I think he is malicious. I've never assumed him to be malicious. Hold on. Thank you, Brian. Thank you. I've never thought of him as being malicious. I think he is a true believer, and again, because we just can't avoid talking about it at this point, but I still want to get back to talking about the documentary. I think the simple fact of the matter, though, is that he is a great example of what you talk about when you say, and I forget, I think you're repeating Keel, that belief is the enemy. Who are you? Is it
belief
Keel,
is definitely the enemy. Yeah, I mean, I have a poster on my wall that I made saying the enemy is belief. It's the old Fox Mulder poster, but instead of I want to believe, the enemy is belief, because the problem is most people in the UFO community, much like Jaime, want to believe. How many people have that poster hanging on their wall in the UFO community?
Oh, absolutely.
You see them interviewed.
No.
They
Almost
want
all
to
of them.
believe. And it's so dangerous to want to believe, because then you're more likely to accept this type of evidence. And I think, to get back to the film, it's worth noting that some of the evidence which Jaime presents in his videos, like allegedly, I don't know enough about it, so I say allegedly, it could be genuine, but he was given this video by the Secretary of Defense or somebody in Mexico, which shows it's kind of it's a little bit like the kind of FLIR footage we're used to seeing of the Tic Tacs, but there's these craft further away and there's a number of them, and it seems like something which is at least anomalous, or at least something which can't be easily explained away. But then that last section of the movie, which was obviously taken whole cloth from one of his own videos, I'm assuming, which is in Spanish and in Italian, I think, right? Because some of the witnesses are talking in Italian, and Jaime and I suppose some of the presenters are talking.
You what it came from?
Well, I'm not sure. Well, I don't even know now what word I may have said in the King's English. Assuming. I can say assuming. Do you like assuming?
There you go. That makes me feel better.
Is assuming better than assuming?
There you go.
Good grief. The English aren't good at many things.
And I'm going to choke into the ground.
Assuming, well, we're already running it into the ground. We're doing our darndest not to, maybe, but we still. But my point is, so there's that case with the FLIR type Mexican footage from the Mexican military that looks legitimate. But the last 20 minutes, the last case looked at before they kind of do the wrap up at the end, is this case about some Italian UFO mystery which is about these aliens, which is a group are called W56 or something, who live in underground caverns and have come to Earth with all the normal platitudes which anybody who's ever read a George Adamski book or any other contactee book has heard 100 times about saving us from nuclear devastation. And there's kind of this galactic order, like in Star Trek, where they can't interfere with us too much, like the Prime Directive, but they can kind of help us along I mean, but
they can have jobs. But they can have jobs in major industries.
Well, and so and they smoke cigarettes and they play violins and enjoy tennis and all these other things. So you get these pieces of evidence which Jaime's presented, which seem like genuinely, this is interesting, this is anomalous. And then you get these other stories which are so anecdotal and weird and conflated and or again, much as we have the platitudes about the kind of almost religious overtones, you also always get in these stories the exact explanation. The crafts are made out of iron and they have magnetic polarity, which they can use a magnetic rope to drill into the earth and make their own. And it's like, how does anybody know this technology? But to accept that as genuinely, so they're two different pieces of evidence again. The distant FLIR video of the strange lights in the sky, that's interesting. This overblown story about aliens living among us and drilling under the earth and having ancient underground bases, it sounds like something out of the Shaver mystery for starters, which at least was
I had the same
interestingly written.
Adamski and Shaver were just like, I'm watching that last half. I want to get back to the first half because I actually think the more interesting stuff is that first half. But I was thinking, like, this is like, this guy's going to need to pay Adamski some royalties here, because it was all these beautiful, different races of aliens that happen to look human mostly, and they were able to interbreed. I'm like, okay, hold on, stop, just stop. That's not how this works. But going back to that, you're right. That last section, it's like, it does kind of take away from the part, because again, Jaime is a real journalist. I may disagree with him on a few things because he started off very much in the ecological section. And let me say, there's a few things I'm not happy with. I would disagree with him on his overall views, but I completely agree with what he was actually doing was boots on the ground, interviews, Mexico, again, Texan right here. What he was talking about was 100% real, still 100% real, because a lot of what he was starting off with was a lot of really egregious ecological situations in Mexico from companies and the government. Starts off as a very legitimate, because he said, I don't want to, his father was like, don't be a journalist, they're all corrupt. He goes, I'm not going to be that kind of journalist, right? And it slowly starts to explore how he got into being what he is now, which is the ufologist, and like the number one ufologist in Latin America, and really even around the world. It's for those, again, Americans are very much in a bubble, in an English only bubble, and we often don't realize how big and profound some of these other people are who are speaking Spanish or Korean, since Donnie's in the chat. How big some of these things can be, particularly in Latin America. And as I drop my microphone, what the heck? There we are. Today is just not my day for technology. My green screen was perfectly fine until we went live. Now my microphone is trying to attack me.
Good grief.
It's a Tuesday.
But I think just quickly before we leave the end bit and go back to the beginning, because we were in the middle of making a point, we might as well make it now, and that is that it shows that Jaime is so picky on what he presents as evidence, and I think that is going to be telling when we come back to the UFO body, mummified body stories later, because if you present that type of WF6 alien colonization story as aggressively as you'll present some FLIR video given to you by the Secretary of Defense in Mexico or whoever the devil it was, they seem like very different evidential levels. So to accept both of them suggests that he's open to accepting all kinds of things as evidence for his beliefs.
Right. And I think, completely agree.
A nail in that and go done.
Yeah. No, and I think you're right. I mean, I think you're 100% right. But he is very big. And one of the things I think they do that the filmmaker does very well, right? Was compare Tucker Carlson's work on ufology post 2017 with Jaime's. It's the same stuff, only Jaime was doing this in the early 2000s. Like, this is, in many ways, Jaime's very ahead of the curve from a from a media perspective. He's been on this for a long time, and it's been far more accepted in Latin America and around the world than it has been here. In fact, that one of the things I'm very sympathetic about is that he is someone who is a young Earth creationist. I thought to grab my copy of the London Hammer, and I didn't. Again, where my sympathies lie is he says something that spoke to me, where he said, hey, we wanted to get this stuff out before, but not give it to the Americans, because the American institution is just going to destroy it. Right. And as someone who's looked at the research for the London Hammer and seen how it's been, sort of mainstream academia has just ignored it, I'm very sympathetic to his positions on all this. I really am. But, and like I said, at no point do I think Jaime has ever been malicious with what he's done or advocated for or presented.
He's almost like Mexico's George Knapp. You know what I mean?
Yes,
like,
no,
it's
exactly.
ironic that they're both at their equivalent hearings as well, while Knapp's sitting in the audience or in the witness stands, or the chairs immediately behind the witnesses, and Jaime is up front and center presenting the evidence. But it's interesting to see when these things are coming to the cultural global foreground that those two journalists are at their equivalent hearings. I found that kind of telling, because I think of them as similarly placed in their two countries in some ways.
Oh, I agree. No, completely agree with you. Although I would argue that Maussan is actually probably more famous in Latin America than George Knapp is in the English-speaking world.
Probably. Well, he had a show with 2 million people apparently watching every week in Mexico.
Oh yeah, no, he's very big, but yeah, I think you're right. He is very much Latin America's George Knapp.
Horace just quickly asked, does Maussan work as an individual or is he part of a team? Well, he was in various TV networks, and when he rolls in to do a documentary, he has people with him. So I guess both. He's Maussan, but he also has people with him who do stuff with him. And he's often on shows, like he was on Gaia Network shows. I think he was on History Channel shows. So he makes appearances in Western media all the time as well.
Oh, yeah. No, he absolutely does. Honestly, again, think of him as an independent journalist, but again, independent here meaning he's like his own company. He has people who work underneath him. So there you go. But I want to get back to the point that you made about how you have this stuff at the beginning about him being a journalist, and because of it, he's in the credibility he's brought to that area within Latin America, that you do have the government bringing him in and doing interviews and them giving him stuff for publication. That you have that, but then to your point, and I think it's very well made. But then the second half of this documentary, he's presenting stuff that's clearly just George Adamski in Italian. Where, again, as we mentioned, these aliens they've come here, they have all this super whiz-bang technology, but they happen to look exactly human, and they all have jobs, because that's how they can't intervene, but they're intervening in like little ways. And they only spoke to him, who's the only one, and this is where my shaver, I can't unsee the shaver stuff now. Thank you, Dr. Bertram.
Pleasure.
But he was the only one who was able to translate their language, because he was more sensitive.
It was totally like the original letter Shaver wrote to Amazing. I thought that as well when I saw it. This is like Manton coming back. But you know what? Just quickly too, I'm not saying that I think the contactees are at the bottom of the evidential barrel. I don't think contactees are any better or worse than abductees in the stories that they tell. I think the point is, it's interesting that Maussan is somebody who'll take all different levels of evidence, while you might get in America a more respectable UFO journalist or UFO investigator might be much more reluctant to take a contactee story, but very happy to look at military video. Do you know what I mean? Well, I don't think in Mawson's realm and maybe it's a cultural thing, I don't think there's that differentiation. So while here at a US congressional hearing, you're going to get things like people talking about Tic Tac videos and people talking about, I can't say what I've actually been told, but it has to do with alien biologics and all these kind of, very sensible, almost sounding evidence. You can't imagine in America George Knapp rolling out paper mache bodies as evidence of alien life. I mean, it's a different world. It's almost the difference between foreign cinema and American cinema. If you're not used to watching like movies from Bollywood or movies from, I don't know, Korea or anywhere, if you're not used to it, and the first time you watch one, you're like, like the cultural sensitivities and expectations are so different. And that's almost, I think, what we saw in these Mexican UFO hearings, because it would have been Can you honestly imagine George Knapp, whether we agree with what he says or not about Lazar and Skinwalker and everything else, actually rolling up in front of the US Congress and presenting these two little alien bodies, which, for whether they're paper mache or not, that's exactly what they look like. Like they're not convincing. But maybe that's just a cultural thing. Maybe we're so used to having this very, scientific presentation, while in the rest of the world, or in parts of the non-English speaking world, they're happier to have another presentation. Might be a cultural bias, but it's worth noting. I mean, it's something which, it's a fascinating aspect of this puzzle, why Mexico's leading ufologist journalist would think this was evidential and that this was going to be respected and not be a laughing stock on the world stage, which is what it very quickly turned into. See, the US hearings didn't turn into a laughing stock. People questioned Grush's suggestion about biologics and the fact that he'd never seen any of this stuff, but most of the evidence presented by the Navy pilots. Graves, incidentally, was in Mexico at that hearing as well. Of course, he'd been flown in to talk there, and later on, he wrote this tweet saying how essentially how horrified he was and what a joke it was that these ridiculous, mummified bodies were shown. That wasn't his language, but he thought it was kind of, darkening the horizons of people like him who were trying to take this stuff seriously. Again, the cultural difference in expectation. So I don't know. I mean, that's just a fascinating part of it. The fact that this could be put forward as evidence in Mexico, and here it never would have been put forward as evidence.
Oh yeah, and so to that point, I think an absolutely valid point would be to make. Then is it that we've become so accustomed to high levels of science fiction and the illusion of scientific accuracy that we expect a certain spit polish to a presentation rather than the substance of the presentation? Again, this is not me sticking up for those things.
No, I get it.
But I think there's a really valid point to say, maybe the issue though is that we expect a level, we want the showmanship rather than the substance, and that may be a big issue. And I would argue that's an issue that we have in other places as well.
Or maybe vice versa. I mean, arguably vice versa. Maybe Mexico wants the showmanship, like the Barnum-esque stuff, and we want some kind of, substantive, well, these are military officers that we can trust. While there you can go, we found these when we were digging in Nazca, Peru, and they're, alien mummies from 1,000 years ago. It's a different kind of story altogether. But
maybe it's just a different type of P.T. Barnum. Maybe it's a different kind of P.T. Barnum, though, right?
It feels like Barnum. I mean, Barnum used to show this kind of stuff, right? Like this is, and Ripley's Believe It or Not, it's somewhere between Barnum and Ripley's Believe It or Not museum, with Charles Fort interjected in the middle. Like this almost seemed like part of that tradition of displaying or talking about absolutely extraordinary things which would have once have maybe appeared literally on the back page. What was the magazine on the back pages when I was a kid? It had Ripley's Believe It or Not, and it had all these weird things like the Fiji Mermaid, and I can't even remember. It was some boys magazine.
This is the time to roll it out. I literally have the Fiji Mermaid.
There you go. Doesn't it feel similar, at least in kind of, it feels similar.
Well, so we need to explain what this is, because not everyone probably knows what a Fiji mermaid is. And if you're listening instead of seeing this, I just recommend hopping over and watching the video, either on the website or on YouTube. But the Fiji mermaid is what's called a gaff. Okay. Gaffs are taxidermied. They're hoaxes, but a lot of times they weren't really designed to be hoaxes. They were more, hey, here's a fun thing, right? If you've ever seen a jackalope, and if you don't know what a jackalope is, then I just can't help you. They're the national cryptid of Texas. Okay, hold on real quick. This is the big, no pun intended, complete rabbit trail here. The first person to officially report a jackalope, his last name was McLean there, and it's actually spelled the way I spelled my name, so we're probably related somehow.
Oh my goodness. That's fantastic. You should have your logo should be a jackalope then, really.
No, that's so hackneyed. But here's the thing. It did lead because of that. I'm like, hold up, I got to stand up for my Klansmen here. It did lead me to the theory, because and I still think it's probably because people have seen rabbits with they get these cancer. They're not really cancerous tumors, but they're hard calcified tumors on their heads, and so they look like they have. I mean, they don't really look like horns, but that's sort of like how you would describe them. And I'm of that persuasion. However, I do think it's something we need to consider is the possibility of mini deer. Like around the world, there are lots of examples of very, very small deer, right? We have, if you had something like a whitetail that had become diminutive and adapted itself to a desert the same way a hare has or a jackrabbit has, with very long ears to control, if it has a lot of the same adaptations, if you're someone who isn't close enough to see what it is, you'd assume it was a jackrabbit with antlers. So that's my little complete rabbit trail on the whole gaff thing. But gaffs are taxidermied creatures, usually by combining others. Okay, Brian, that's actually really good. I may have to do something with that. Thank you, Brian. McLinalope. That's really clever. I like that. So that's what a gaff is, right? It's a taxidermy thing. They were usually for fun. They weren't really designed to be taken seriously, but some people did take them seriously. And throughout in fact, let me throw myself under the bus. Young Earth creationists, it is very common for people to, there was something that popped up about 10 years ago of what was supposed to be a taxidermied baby plesiosaur that had been been found washed up. Thing turned out to be a gaff. A lot of people were very excited about it. But here's where we get back to our mummified aliens. I threw up this picture at the beginning. This is called the Metapec creature. And in 2007, this was like the biggest thing in the cryptozoological world. I actually got a chance to talk to Lauren Coleman, all online. Lauren Coleman would never pick me out of a lineup if he had to. If his life depended on it, he'd never pick me out. We've spoken in person several times, but this is my first real contact with Lauren Coleman, was with this creature. Again, if you're listening, imagine a gray alien looking creature, very, very small, has its hand, but with a tail, and its hand trapped in a looks like a bear trap. So the story behind this is that this was either an alien or a chupacabra or both that had been caught and died, and they preserved the body, and here it is. This was big. DNA evidence was supposedly thrown out and said, look, this is alien DNA. We had x-rays showing, experts talking about how, again, from Latin America, talking about how this is just not anything we've ever seen before, ever. And then someone gets a hold of it that's sort of outside, and they're like, yeah, no, this is a monkey.
Monkey.
Yeah, it's a monkey. It's a taxidermied gaff.
And incidentally, photos of Jaime Maussan holding that thing and looking, questioningly, like,
Well, hold on. We haven't gotten to the best part yet. Don't get ahead of the story on this one.
Just saying.
I'm just saying, hold on. Don't get ahead of the story. So the taxidermist who created it came out and said, yeah, this is a gaff. I made it. Here's the thing. That the Metapec creature was brought to you by Jaime Maussan. There wasn't just pictures of him. He was the one presenting this thing to the world as real with his experts, showing that this was a truly alien creature.
Can you imagine him getting before the US Congress after having done that? And we're going to go further and being able to present to paper mache aliens?
Oh,
again, cultural differences, man.
Cultural differences, but don't get ahead of the story. Because we have...
It's hard not to cut to that chase.
I know. Hold on. We'll get there. The Fairy.
Fantastic.
Yeah, this was like 2015, 2016 era. Jaime Maussan produced this. L.A. Marzulli got caught up in it. It was presented as a real fairy that had been shot by a hunter with a shotgun. There were lead pellets in it, the whole 9 yards. Again,
bad mojo shooting a fairy.
I know. That's what I was thinking too. Like, first of all, why would you shoot a fairy? Anyway, long story short, Here it is. We had the x-rays, we had the DNA test, whole 9 yards, right? It's a gaff. We found out it's a gaff. It was being held together by plastic. It was made, I forget what it was made out of, whereas the other one was a tuft monkey. This one, I forget what it was, but the wings were bat wings that they had, manipulated. But again, it's a gaff.
But good looking gaffs, in fairness.
Yeah, again, I'm sorry, but the Metapet creature, whoever taxidermied this thing should be really proud of it, because it had a lot of, and I do mean a lot of people thinking this was real for a while. Because
they want to believe is why.
Exactly. They want to believe. Now, this brings us to 2017. This particular mummy may look really familiar. It's very, very similar to the ones that were presented, because they came out of the same, supposedly, they came from the same mine. This is the same, this is the same thing. They were presented as anomalous. Experts present them as anomalous. They were proven to be gaffes. These creatures, the things that were presented, the reason they look like this is because they're coming from the same place. A gaff. And we have this is the Atacama, alien that is as presented. This one, very sadly, is not a gaff. Now, you'll notice most photographs only have it looking this way, so you can see what looks like a fin on the top of its head. It is not. This was very sadly a young girl who was born with a very profound deformity. This was a human girl. Unfortunately, she lived to be about between 6 to 8 years old, and her body was preserved naturally. If you see it more head on, it does. You can see what's happening. There's the sagittal suture is sort of growing on top of itself. It's, instead of merging, this was a child who suffered from a profound birth defect, and this is what's happened. So again, these are just the biggest ones.
These are Jaime, by the way.
These are all Jaime. It isn't just he was somehow slightly connected or whatever. No. Jaime presented all of these to the world as real, as legitimate. He had all of the things that he had experts who were, yes, no, these are real, geneticists, whole 9 yards. And then anyone else gets a hold of these things, suddenly it's like, no, this is a tuft marmoset. Again, this is a tuft marmoset, and we found the guy who actually put it together. So my thing is, I don't think they're paper mache at all. I do think they are, however, gaffs.
Not as good a taxidermist or gaffist as these ones. It was like somebody who was just he'd failed taxidermy school, so he was cheaper to hire. We need a gaff made, but we can't afford that guy who did that really cool looking fairy thing. This guy's going to do it for $20. $20, man, get him to make us. Get him makes 2. We can afford 40. Get 2 of those things made. Anyway, just quickly, while I'm stopped before I facetious, I'm going to flash this up. Thank you so much for downloading these. Of course, you're right. There are similarities, although this one that we put on the screen now is the Peruvian mummy that first rolled out, I think, around 2017 or something, right? It is far more convincing looking, even though, again, gaff, as it's now been totally discredited, but it's meant to be from the same place in Peru, I believe, as the current mummies. Gaia did a series on this, and they had smaller mummies, which were much more like the ones that Jaime's showing us now as well in that series. I think history might have touched on this as well, but it's interesting that that's all been like forgotten and or discredited, but a similar, not as convincing looking version of it, or 2 of them are presented now on the world stage at a congressional hearing in Mexico. And we're meant to, the UFO community is ahistorical. That's the problem. If you watch a lot of these videos, which are just extracts of it on YouTube, you'll get people going, oh, this is amazing, finally. And you think, is this literally your first rodeo? Like, did you just did you just become interested in the field like a day ago? Because there's this long string of what you just pointed out so well. Thank you so much for downloading them and presenting them. You did an awesome job to contextualize this, which is the main thing we try to do on this show, to contextualize everything we talk about. Nothing exists in a vacuum, but it seems like every time a new story like this pops out, ufology behaves like it's the first time the actor, and I mean that as the individual involved, and or this type of evidence has been presented, and they get all excited again every time.
So real quick,
because they want to believe.
Because they want to believe. Real quick, Ken Imrock was talking about a gaff, in northern Michigan. He went as scouting, and they'd go there and they'd have fish with legs on them. Yeah, there's all kinds of gaffs. In fact, another one was called the furred trout. That was supposed that again. Ripley's, believe it or not, had it. Barnum and Bailey had them.
The Pit Down Man is a really famous one.
Oh yeah, that's the Pit Down. Don't even get me started on Pit Down Man. But yeah, so I mean, these things have a long history, and sometimes, again, if you in the right context, they're fun, taxidermied little things. But the problem is they have often been presented as real by people who either just didn't get the joke or whatever. And that seems to be what's going on here. Horace Smith has a great point. And I think and this goes back to our point about, belief being the issue. He wants to believe these. And the problem is he's getting experts who are telling him what he wants to hear, and that which bothers me. So let me play Jaime's real quick. Barbara asks, who's Jaime? Jaime Maussan is the, again, today's documentary is the Maussan Files. Jaime is a journalist who is essentially one of the leading ufologists in Latin America. And he's the one who presented these bodies in the Mexican Congress last week.
We should say too, Jaime is spelled Jamie in English.
Yes.
So you might, I've even said Jamie. I probably did even during the show. It's just
a lot of people have said Jamie.
English bias, although I know it's Jaime. But to Horace Smith's point very quickly, he said, after those fails, could Maussan honestly believe in the alien mummies? Maybe, but I would think such belief would require personal rather than cultural weakness in critical thinking. Well, I'm not suggesting even so much Maussan's cultural weakness in thinking. I'm suggesting that if there had been somebody who had presented 4 versions of these dead alien beings prior to this one, there's no way in hell that the US Congress, for all of his many failings, would bring him out as the key witness and let him present 2 paper mache aliens. And I know I'm being facetious when I'm saying paper mache aliens, because unlike the other ones that you presented tonight, which could fool somebody on first glance, or if they'd never heard of the other stories, I don't think what was presented in Mexico last week should fool anybody regardless of their previous exposure to these type of evidence, because the things looked either like maybe statues which had been dug up and then presented as aliens, but they supposedly had x-rays as well, but they just looked so hokey. Literally, again, I'm not boasting because I'm a terrible sculptor, but I've made more convincing gray extraterrestrials out of paper mache myself. Like, it wasn't a good job. The previous guys they had do this, they did amazing jobs. The people who made these things did not do a good job.
And again, back to the point, I think there's how can he convince himself these things are real given his history? I think the simple fact of the matter is, though, again, outside of belief, I think he does what a lot of people in not just this field, a lot of field, again, throwing myself under the bus on this one, right? It's very easy to say, well, the problem is they were real, but then this mainstream academia stepped in and they're calling it a fake, and therefore everyone thinks it's fake. Again, London Hammer. I'm a proponent of the London Hammer. However, my issue is the mainstream will not actually look at it at all under any circumstances. They ignore it. Versus these things which are found and then presented, and then once anyone else gets their hand on them, again, Elliot Marzulli was able to show those that he got taken in for a very short time. Respect the man, but he was able to show that they were faked because he got a hold of it, and he was able to have his people look at it, and it showed that they were that the fairy was a gaff. Again, someone else got a hold of Metapec. someone else got a hold of Atta and said, no, this is a small child that was deformed. And I find that one very, very sad. But the simple fact of the matter is, the problem is, I can see how he would look at this and say, my experts are telling me that they're real, therefore these people are lying because they're part of the cover-up. They're all part of the secret cabal, right?
There's also something called cognitive dissonance, which is worth noting as well.
Which is where we're going.
Sometimes if something bangs up against your belief, if the facts collide with your beliefs, then you would think that somebody would automatically go with the facts and throw their beliefs overboard. But what multiple studies have suggested is that people will double down. Not everybody, but a lot of people will double down when their beliefs are threatened, and they will believe more. They'll be more likely to believe the next gaff that comes along, because their beliefs become strengthened by the resistance from the outsiders.
Oh, 100%. I mean, this is just how humans work. And the problem is, it isn't like mainstream academia or the government have done themselves any favors over the last, well, I'd say 50 years, but let's just be polite, over the last few decades with how they've approached any of this. They haven't, right? Not getting political in any way, but let's look at the history of just the medical field. Again, not even thinking what you're thinking. Things like SSRIs, how they work, whether or not they work, Alzheimer's research. There is a lot going on that has shown that mainstream academia is not really doing the work that it's claiming to do, but rather is either doing whatever the highest bidder will do, or just saying, well, whatever, we're going to roll with it. Like, any way you slice it, neither the government nor mainstream academia has done themselves any favors over the last couple of decades. And so it would be very easy for someone in Jaime's position to look at that and say, well, I'm going to trust my people over here. Well, the problem is, are your people actually doing the work?
And I think specifically in the scientific establishment, you were right when you said over 50 years, because I think a lot of the current behavior of ufology, certainly between 1969 and up until 2017, where the New York Times story broke, was pretty much formed by the reporting of the Condon Committee, the UFO, Colorado University's UFO study, when it seemed to be pretty clear at the time, even to people like Hynek and Vallée, who were once kind of consulting it, and then they walked away because it was so obviously biased, that they didn't want to be presenting themselves as farcical to the rest of the scientific establishment by taking UFOs seriously. So even though within the Condon Committee report, which is like, a massive tome, there are things which seem to beg further study, Edward Condon's conclusion is that the US government doesn't have to worry about this stuff anymore, and the Air Force, you can close your books. And so after that is when you see ufology really start to travel down more esoteric trails. Like Jacques Vallée walks away and writes Passport to Magonia. So you start to get that more occultic view of ufology. Maybe this isn't extraterrestrial. Maybe we can explain it within the cultural tradition of fairy faith and religions. And then you also get the rise of belief in increasing ideas of weird government conspiracies like Roswell cover-ups and secret deals with aliens and underground alien bases. And then you get the idea of abductions coming to the fore, because the scientific community pretty much said ufology no. And then so the ufology went its own way, and it went into all kinds of different corners. So in a way, the scientific establishment is to blame for the way, and I'm never been a fan of the scientific establishment, that anybody who watches or listens to this show knows, but I really I really think in this case, Condon, to your point, is a classic example, not just of a broader look at the scientific establishment, where you're right as well, but to narrow it down to ufology. You can see perhaps the most significant investigation into the UFO phenomenon ever, mishandled it politically, And when I say
Yep.
politically, I don't mean left or right. I mean because they didn't want to come across as crazy UFO people. So they worked out how to shut it down and walk away
Yeah.
and look responsible, which is what the Lowe memo talked about, which is another story into itself. But my point is, yeah, you were absolutely right. There has been a division, and there's been a cultural crisis in ufology when it comes to those type of traditional approaches to what's real and what's not
Mhm.
real. It existed before Condon, but after Condon, it was magnified 100 times.
Oh yeah. Well, in this, to bring it back to Maussan, it's like I said, I'm very sympathetic to Jaime. I think he is a true believer, and that's my position because I've again, he's been around for a while. He's been on my radar for a very long time, and at no point has I again, like Eric Von Daniken. I have never doubted Von Daniken's desire as a truth seeker. I disagree with him. I don't like the work that I think the work that he's done has a lot of problems, but I've never thought that that Von Daniken was manipulative necessarily in any way. I don't think he's being malicious. I don't think Jaime is malicious. And I think he's legitimately trying to live up to the thing he told his father before his father died, which is that he would not be one of these journalists who was just doing it for money, right? That he was going to be honest, that he was going to be forthright. I believe he's trying to live. That's covered in the documentary. I think he's trying to live up to that, which is an admirable goal. I think he should. The problem is, in the same way, though, I think, let's face it, I think it would be very easy for someone in his position to, like you said, double down on these beliefs, because he'll say, no, these were all real, but someone paid off this guy to claim that he did a fake taxidermy. Somebody paid off, someone to tell Ellie Marzulli that this thing was fake, the fairy was faked, right? I could see him believing that, so that when you have people say, hey, look, these things are gaffes, it's just reinforcing in his mind, no, it's because these other people are out there doing things. They're throwing on, they're trying to make it look bad because they're still trying to hide this, right? So to your point about how the documentary has legitimate, military aircraft FLIR footage at the beginning, again, he was doing this long before it became popular here. But then they also end with this very George Adamski Shaver-esque dude who's like, yes, no, the piece, the hippie aliens are here. They're 3 different races, but they made a 4th because they can crossbreed. They look like humans. They have jobs. They like to drink and play violin, but they can't interfere, but they are interfering, and they polarize metal. And it's like, and I'm the only one who can read their language because I'm very special, because I'm super psychic. By the way, humans are super psychic. We just don't know that we are. Like, it was Adamski. It was this. It was as if Adamski and Shaver had some child. Like, that's what.
Imagine if they'd met. I would have loved to have been there with Shaver and Adamski, ever met and had a conversation. Can you imagine?
Oh yeah, it'd be fun. But yeah, so it's like, the point is that you have both of those stories right there, side by side, in this documentary, and Maussan is taking them both very seriously with the same degree and same level of profundity. And I think that's I think it's indicative of how we got to where we got last week with these mummified aliens. And it's again, I think he's trying to be honest. I really do. But unfortunately, I think he's put himself in a bad situation because he's allowing belief is the enemy. He's allowing himself to be led by his beliefs rather than the data. And it's brought us to today.
And I don't want to be ageist either, because I really do hate it. I mean, I hate people who dismiss people because they're older, but I do think, as perhaps in a field like this, when you're getting older and on in your years, you're more and more eager for some kind of truth. I know Don Schmidt, when I had him on, I don't think I'm telling tales out of school, because I think he actually said it on the show. Maybe he said it behind the scenes. Maybe I shouldn't say that. Let me rephrase it. I think, for example, that Jacques Vallée, who I have the utmost respect for, I think the book that he wrote with Paola Harris, Trinity, the Best Kept Secret, where he kind of goes back on things he's spoken about for years, about how ufologists are so tempted by a physical interpretation. He even termed it the lure of the physical as a type of fallacy of ufology. That I hope it's not the last book that Vallée ever writes, because I treasure his books. I have all of them on my shelf over here, including Trinity. But it seems that he was prepared finally, perhaps because he's, because he is getting on in years, to try to find something which validates physically what he's been chasing for, 70 years now or something.
Yeah.
So perhaps in a way that, there could be, I don't like to psychologize because it's cheap and nasty. And I'm not trying to be cheap or nasty, but it's conceivable if you're a real believer in this and you've been invested in it for decades and decades and decades, you would like to get that piece of evidence in your hand, or that story which finally validated what you had spent your life chasing, because it's so ephemeral. Ufology, cryptozoology, specter chasing, all of this stuff. I can't talk because I've dedicated a great piece of my life to at least the academic and sociological study and historical study of this. But it's something that's very hard to get your hands on when you want to start looking at it as a genuine phenomenon. And I do think there's a phenomenon behind a lot of this, as I've said many times.
Oh, yeah.
But to try to prove that, if you spend your life talking about it and writing about it and chasing it, perhaps when you're in your 70s, in your 80s, you start to think, I want to nail that piece of evidence so bad. And so perhaps you're more susceptible to things that when you were 30 or 40 or 50, you mightn't have been so likely to have grabbed a hold of.
It's possible. Or again, maybe you just you do get jaded at the rest of the world, and you just say, of course they're going to say it's a lie because they have a vested interest in it being a lie versus true. So it's
combination, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, it is what it is. And the problem is, like I said, the mainstream scientific community has not done itself any favors over the last 50 years, really, as far as that goes, right?
I think just quickly, Jamie Leonardo has made an excellent comment, who hosts the fantastic show Down South Anomalies on the network you're listening to now, Untold Radio Network. And he says, the internet is the new Colosseum. The lines are blurred between showman and shaman. The temptation to embellish, even if your intention is true, is the ultimate rabbit hole. And I think the internet is that, Jamie. And I think for a long time, as I'm sure Jamie would agree, the pressures on people who've had actual experiences to embellish with things which mightn't really be evidence, but appear on the surface to be evidence, is also part of this psychological aspect of pushing things which aren't true that I'm talking about. And I know people like John Keel and others in the past talked about maybe some of the contactees, without having proof, wanted proof so badly that they went out and hoaxed it. I think Gray Barker said things like that. It's part of the phenomenon, like he'd hoax himself. Gray Barker would hoax and go, it's part of the phenomenon, because maybe it is part of the phenomenon. Maybe there's something out there, and our response to it, which sometimes includes believing or pushing hoaxes, is as much a part of it as anything else is.
No, I think that's a valid point. I've actually said the same thing. I think there are, sadly, again, in my context with people, again, no names, no nothing, but I've run across people who I think did have legitimate encounters, but then they then sort of discredit themselves by creating faked evidence because they want people to believe that their encounters were real. And it's like, well, but hold on, everyone already believes you. Why are you going that extra step? Well, because, to your point, maybe that is part of the phenomenon. Maybe that is, people want to believe, they want to be taken seriously, and so they will fake it because they want to prove to the world that they're not crazy. And let me help you out here, for anyone who has that thought. That doesn't help. It doesn't help when you're making your own Bigfoot trackways with stompers or with your hand, and we can see what you did there. Just saying. Sometimes the story just has to be what it is. It's you were an eyewitness to something. Sometimes that's just the nature of what it is, right? But again, to your point, is this I can't look in Jaime's head and say what's going on. What I can say is there's a history there. He does appear to be genuinely concerned, and I'll give him that benefit of the doubt. But within that benefit of the doubt, I think there's a window of what could be happening here. Why would he present what he's presented to the Mexican Congress? And that's what it is. I think we've spoken ad nauseum about it. Again, I think he's a good-hearted guy, but belief is the enemy here. So,
and it almost always is, at least when it comes to interpretations of the paranormal and the anomalous.
Yeah. And to answer Barbara's question, yeah, you can go find me over at Jason McLean Questions Everything. Me and Donnie hang out there a lot. Yeah.
And you should. I think we had one more comment from Jamie. Now, let's just finish Jamie's comment quickly. Mausan is so reflective of Bill Moore, MUFON 89. Big respect to all. Hi to Barb and the brilliant Brian. And yes, it does bring back connotations, perhaps, or reminiscences of Moore's speech at MUFON 89, which we've spoken about so many times. And perhaps this is part of some broader disinformation push, or maybe it's just the disinformation push that is belief. Maybe we don't need agencies and alphabet soup groups to trick us and fool us. Maybe all they need to do is stir the pot that we've already put the ingredients into and lit the fire underneath.
Yep. I've often thought that a lot of because again, we do know, and we've talked about it on this channel a lot, particularly in this show, that we do know for a fact that the United States government and others have actively intervened in ufology to create certain beliefs. But that doesn't mean they had to. I do think, though, that it's more, with the exception of a few people, it's more nudges than, like, they don't have to create. They just have to give just enough. We'll do the rest, right? So yeah, more like a little nudges here and there, and we sell ourselves on their own lie. So there you go. On that note, well, it's been another episode. Apparently an episode where everything that could have possibly gone. I kept clicking the buttons to try and let Dean on to start the I don't know what's going on today, but apparently everything electronic is breaking today. So hopefully by next week maybe the gremlins got out of the library. That's the problem. They've infected my machine. But it is what it is. On that note, we'll see you next week behind the card catalog. Good night, everybody.